We left off talking about monopoly, and recall that a monopoly is a situation where there's only one seller of a product. Because they're the sole seller of the product, they can basically charge the price that they want, not the price that someone else decides they ought to charge, such as the market. We don't necessarily see monopoly situations arise very often. This is certainly true in agricultural and food markets. Instead, what we sometimes see are what are called oligopoly markets. And oligopoly markets are not quite as extreme as monopoly markets. The idea here is that there's a few sellers, but each is large enough to influence the volume that's sold on the marketplace and thus have some impact on price. Now within agriculture and the food industry, examples where we might have oligopoly power, that is a few sellers who can exert what's called market power, include major farm machinery companies, farm chemical companies, major meat packers, major supermarket chains. Outside of the agricultural industry, the auto industry is often viewed by some as an oligopolistic market. Now, what's important to understand here is that oligopolists are interdependent in their decision making. The decision that an individual firm makes about its price and other market variables depends on what other firms in the industry may do in response to that. And so there's a two-way street. I as a firm might be choosing a particular level of price to charge for a customer, but the level of price that I'm going to choose to charge will depend on what my other firms are doing. Now, other firms, in turn, will try to look at the price I might charge and make pricing decisions accordingly. And so there's what we call a strategic interaction between firms in this kind of a setting. Now, there's a number of reasons why we can see oligopolistic industries arise. One reason is that there might be some extreme product differentiation that gives some firms within an industry the ability to price at a level higher than the perfectly competitive norm, but not in a way that's consistent with monopoly. Another reason why we see oligopolistic industries are the high costs of entry associated with some sectors. If you think about some of the examples that we illustrated before, there could be some very high entry costs with respect to the physical plant that one has to have in order to produce, but also the equipment that's needed to produce the output that you're going to sell. At the same time, dependence on costly and long-term research and development efforts can lead to oligopoly industries because the time that it takes in order for a product to come to fruition through a research and development process is so long that only firms that have the ability to charge a price above a competitive price and earn some extra profits, that is excess profits, are able to undertake those activities. Note that 1 and 2 are really just general specific examples of the general notion of an entry barrier associated with imperfect competition. Another entry barrier that we sometimes also see is that there could be problems with respect to access of capital. Some firms that might want to enter into an oligopolistic industry or into some other industry may not have access to capital because they either are too risky or because capital markets are not pricing the cost of capital, that is the interest rate that you would lend to a particular firm, at a way that makes it financially viable for new firms to enter into the market. Now, the other reason why we see oligopolistic industries arise is often from very aggressive corporate growth strategies. And the idea here is that firms that are already in the industry, these are called incumbent firms. Those incumbent firms probably have growth strategies that are designed to cement their position in the marketplace and to actually give them a stronger toehold in the market that then gives them even more oligopoly power. Now, oligopolists have limited control over price. Now they can choose the level of output, and based on that level of output there's going to be some price that will clear the market, but they have somewhat limited choice over the price that they're going to charge, which is different from a monopolist. This is not to say that they're still price taking. In fact, they're not price taking. But here, the idea is that if a firm tries to raise its price, other oligopolistic firms will not necessarily follow, which could lead in a drop in sales for the firm that raised their price. At the same time, if the firm tried to lower its price, competing firms will immediately lower their prices to keep from losing market share. Now what that means is that there's a lower price with a little change in sales, and so there's a decline in profit. So neither one of those options are actually very appealing options to firms. The other issue that often arises with lower prices is that it could lead to what are called price wars. And this is where the price in an oligopolistic industry becomes progressively lower and lower and lower and lower until it hits a marginal cost and then it'll rise back up to some not oligopolistic level because firms have realized, well, wait a minute, through the process of this price war, we're actually eroding our excess profits, and we don't want to do that. And so instead of charging at a place where price equals marginal cost, we'll go back to the price at which we started at. Now, that process generally leads to sticky prices in oligopolistic industries. As well, the differences in those prices, that is, the differences between prices for two different firms, can often be the result of successful product differentiation. The stable price behavior, however, is not necessarily the result of collusion, but rather rational economic decision by each firm. Now, what's important here is it's not to say that oligopolistic firms can't collude. In fact, there's been a number of examples in the agricultural input industry where there has been overt collusion between firms. They've been actually identified as firms that have done this. They were price fixing, and they were also allocating shares of the market to one another in a way that allows them to actually behave a bit more like a monopoly than an oligopoly. Archer Daniels Midland was one company that was found guilty of this in the United States when it came to the production of lysine, and they faced very substantial fines from the US government. There are a number of other examples that we'll probably talk about in class on Monday to try to illustrate these general concepts of collusion and what can happen when, in fact, oligopolistic firms begin to behave in a way that's collusive. Now, you might be wondering, why does this matter? Well, one of the reasons why all of this matters is that oligopoly, like monopoly power, results in distortions in prices from the competitive norm. And because of that, we know that there's going to be a deadweight loss. Now, the other reason why this matters, or another reason why this matters, is that consumers and farmers often complain that grocery prices remain high even when farm prices fall. This is called asymmetric price transmission. And the notion here is that consumers are made worse off because retail price is high, farmers are made worse off because farm price is low, and it's that marketing intermediary, the person who's converting that food or the agricultural commodity into a food good that's benefiting from it. And they're benefiting from it in a way that reflects some sort of imperfect competition. This isn't to say that firms who change an agricultural commodity into a food product shouldn't benefit, it's just that they have excess economic profits compared to the competitive norm. Now, because of that, it's often the case that economists argue that these markets might function more efficiently if larger firms are broken up. So, for instance, if Monsanto was broken up into component smaller firms, or if Archer Daniels Midland was broken up into component smaller firms, or Maple Leaf Foods was broken up into component smaller firms. What's important to recognize here is that while breaking up these large firms that might have oligopoly power might make the market more efficient in terms of where price settles, it does come at a cost in terms of international competitiveness and also control of R&D. What I mean here is that we may actually face higher costs of production with these smaller firms that affects the competitiveness of firms in Canada on the global marketplace. As well, those smaller firms are less likely to be able to undertake research and development projects that allow them to capitalize on new innovations that either make them more competitive or results in new products and processes on the marketplace and allows them to gain greater economic benefits. Now, another fact or form of market power that we see, or imperfect competition, is monopolistic competition. Now remember, this is the case where we've assumed away the homogeneous product assumption. So products are no longer perfectly identical or homogeneous. And in fact, there's a differentiation in products that different firms sell. Now, whether or not that differentiation is real or imaginary depends on the context that you're dealing with. And sometimes the product differentiation might be an imaginary kind of product differentiation in the eyes of the consumer because they think that maybe one firm has just got a stronger reputation than another, when in fact the qualitative characteristics of the products are identical. Now, the differentiation of those products also gives sellers some ability or some flexibility in terms of how they price. Now, how firms go about differentiating is actually really complicated. This kind of differentiation includes identifying differences such as brand names. So, one brand might be preferred to another brand, or through advertising claims of the superior product over something that someone else is selling. Now, we often see this in food and agricultural markets. If you pick up the Ontario Farmer or a number of different farm press, popular press magazines and newspapers, you'll often see ads for branded feeds or branded feed supplements, and especially purebred livestock. In the food industry, we often see this happening with respect to advertising of products like breakfast cereals. And in fact, the breakfast cereal industry has been identified as one where there's probably a high degree of monopolistic competition amongst firms in the industry. They're trying to differentiate their products from one another in various ways, shapes, and forms, often through using advertising as a way to convince the consumer that the product is better than some rival firm's product. Now, differentiation can actually lead to very vigorous competition amongst firms. These forms of competition include the condition of sale, the level of advertising, as well as real differences in product quality. To get a sense of this, think about walking through a grocery store and looking at the different brand names for various items, the prices that they're priced at, and their location on the store shelf. Often the location of a product on a store shelf will tell you something about its quality, where those higher quality products that typically have higher prices and typically give the grocery store a higher margin are placed more at the eye level of the person who they're trying to attract. So for instance, in the breakfast cereal aisle, you'll often see brand name grocery products that are targeted to children, that is to say they've got a lot of sugar in them, often at the eye level of kids in their marketplace. Whereas for adults, those products that might have a higher margin and are trying to be differentiated in the eyes of consumers might be at the eye level of an average adult. Now, what's also important what is important to recognize here is that this differentiation doesn't come for free. It has a cost. It has a very significant cost. And the monopolistic competitive firms' marketing strategies tend to be very, very costly. And the reason for that is that they have to invest money either in trying to improve the quality of their product so that it is actually differentiated from some rival product, or trying to build some reputation effects in the marketplace by convincing consumers that their product is a better product than some rival products. And that's typically done through advertising. And advertising is a very expensive form of media communication for a lot of firms. And so the marketing budgets for these firms tends to be very large. Now, one thing that's starting to be interesting in food markets is the presence of social media. And so, Facebook is part of this, but Twitter is also very significant, going to be a very significant factor in this, as companies start engaging social media managers to try to communicate with consumers about the features and advantages of their product compared to some rival products. Now, I think what's also important is that while firms will try to spend a lot of money to differentiate the product in the eyes of the consumer and try to price in a way that earns the firm additional profits, is that the prices between two different products that are viewed as differentiated cannot diverge far from one another. Because if they did, what would happen is that at some point the price gap might get so large, the price of one product might be so high compared to another one, that a consumer decides to switch to the other lower priced product. And so there is some substitutability between these products, but it's tempered in the sense that it's not perfect substitutability. Now, because of the impact of the cost of trying to differentiate your product from your rival products, entry tends to be much more difficult in monopolistic competitive markets than in perfectly competitive markets. And again, this is just a reflection of the fact that there's very large capital requirements needed to either start up or to gain a market share. The advertising costs also tend to get passed on to consumers, often in the form of higher prices, which is arguably bad. But you also have to recognize that some form of information is necessary so that consumers know that these products exist and also how they're different from one another. Now, firms will sometimes, instead of focusing on a particular brand, will often use their brand name as a way of trying to differentiate their product on the basis of reputation. So for instance, Kellogg's, Quaker Oats, Post Cereal are all examples of breakfast cereal manufacturers that have very strong reputations in the marketplace, and they capitalize on that reputation with the introduction of products where they're trying to differentiate on the basis of quality, bundled with the brand name effect. Now, to illustrate what's going on here, what I want to do is draw a very simple diagram that looks a lot like a monopoly diagram, but it's somewhat different. And so we're going to look at a monopolistic competitive firm in the short run. So we have a demand curve, we have a marginal revenue curve. I'm illustrating that with the mouse right now. And then we also have this short run marginal cost curve. The monopolistic competitive firm is going to price at the point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Sorry, is going to choose a level of output where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That's going to be QS. If they're deciding to produce QS units of output, they'll map up from QS to the demand curve to decide on the price that they're going to sell at. That's going to be PS. And they'll face a marginal cost of MCS. Now that looks a lot like the monopolistic solution, but what's subtly different here is that we actually introduce the average total cost curve for the monopolistic competitive firm to illustrate the fact that the profits are a little bit smaller for these monopolistic competitive firms because they face some degree of competition from products with which they're viewed as a substitute and for which they're differentiated on the basis of quality. So this curve that I'm drawing here, the ATC, that's the average total cost curve in the short run for this monopolistic competitive firm. And what we know is that at QS units of output, the average total cost curve is going to occur right here. That's going to be the level of average total cost. And so with QS units of output, they have average total cost of ATCS, and their profits are going to be this green area. Now, why we're concerned about monopolistic competitive firms is that those short-run profits, coupled with the fact that products are imperfect substitutes and they can be differentiated on the basis of quality, means that these firms that are earning these profits in the short run face the threat of entry from new firms. And that threat of entry from new firms can actually play a very important role. Okay, so with those economic profits in the short run, entry would actually shift the demand curve for this firm down or the cost curve up and would result in lower profits. Now I said a couple of things that are important here. I said it would either shift the demand curve down or the cost curve up. And what's going on in these different cases is important. If the entrant steals customers from that incumbent firm, from the firm that's in the market already, their demand curve is going to shift down. On the other hand, if that incumbent firm, the firm that's already in the marketplace, decides to try to fight the entry of the entrant by having more advertising or trying to differentiate their product more, their average cost curve is going to shift up. You can sometimes see both of these things happening at the same time. The punchline is that the gap between price and average total cost at the level of output will then start to shrink and you'll see lower economic profits. And in fact, when there's no gap between the demand curve and the average total cost curve at the level of output, there's no economic profits to attract other entrants. And so what's going on here is that if you think about this from the longer run perspective where there's the potential for entry, the firm's demand curve could shift down as some of their customers are stolen by new entrants, or their cost curves could shift up as they try to fight entrants through advertising and through enhanced product differentiation. And then what would end up happening is that the average total cost curve in the long run, ATCL, would be just tangent to the demand curve at the level of output, right here. And so you still have this zero economic profit condition in the long run with this monopolistic competitive firm. It's just that those profits have been bid into fighting the entrant either through trying to maintain some customers or maintain customers through expenditure of money through things like advertising and R&D, or through the loss of customers and a shifting down of the demand curve until it's just tangent to that long-run average cost curve.
This is a good place to stop. We'll pick up with these ideas in class on Wednesday and then follow up with another video on pricing and pricing strategies used by firms for the class on Friday.